kudos for the beauty of Vancouver. I know that the New York Times has described Vancouver as the Manhattan with mountains, and I think that just shows the Times bias to New York City. I actually think it's quite nicer than that, so that shows my bias. I'm going to talk a little bit about, as Michael said, the role of the auditor and the CAQ's perspectives about that, and then update you on some of our activities. I think it will tee up some of the, or continue some of the discussions that we've been having this morning, which I find very interesting and I think are at the crux of what we're all trying to focus on. The CAQ, we're 5 years old now. We're still a relatively new organization, and in everything that we do, we really remain dedicated to enhancing investor confidence and public trust in our global capital markets and also high-quality audits and the public company auditing profession. So that's going to kind of color my perspectives. And we are very focused on audit quality, although we too struggle with how to best define audit quality. But so hopefully some of the work that we all do in the next 2 days at this forum will help move that ball. So we've spent a lot of the last year talking about the role of the auditor and where the role of the auditor should be and where it could go, both in terms of the current work that the auditor does, as well as expanding the role of the auditor. So as we talked about just in the last panel here, there have been many examinations by many different bodies about the root causes of the financial crisis. And I think there's pretty much consensus that while the audit profession was not part of the root cause, that it behooves all of us to take a step back and look about our role and responsibility, and are there things that we could do differently. But I do think it's important that, at least from my perspective, I haven't heard anybody say that the profession caused or contributed heavily to the financial crisis. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't take a step back and look at what we could do. So what we do at the CAQ as we examine various issues is to bring together a variety of stakeholders. So we view one of our primary jobs as a public policy organization to convene key stakeholders who have an interest in the public policy issue of the day. And so we have done that with respect to the role of the auditor. We have brought together in 4 cities across the United States a variety of stakeholders, including preparers, audit committees, regulators or ex-regulators, accountants, and academics, and most importantly, I think, for this purpose, investors. And so we've brought them together to talk about what is the role of the auditor, how should the auditor's role be expanded. We have heard interesting things which will feed into the work that complements what the PCAOB is doing, and so I'll walk through some of that here in just a bit. And one of the things that we're also looking at is, do we expand those discussions to talk to others in the United States and actually globally so that we can better feed into that discussion. So we've heard many references this morning to Dan Gelzer's speech coming up and how none of us want to steal his thunder. So I am sure that part of what Dan will talk about is the PCAOB's concept release that they've recently issued just last month, talking about how auditors report out on the work that they do and how that should or perhaps could be changed. So I'm not going to outline all of that, although I think there are some important issues that I would like to highlight as we think about what Dan's going to tell us and as we all think about that. And this gets into the CAQ's comment letter. One thing I would say is that I view these 2 bodies of work that the CAQ is undertaking as very, very integrally related but different. One is at the PCAOB's level, what they're looking at is how the current work of the auditor is reported upon. One of the things that we're looking at, and I think that regulators in the United States and abroad will continue to look at, is how should the role of the auditor be expanded and changed. So I think that those are different ideas, but very, very related. So as we looked at the work of the PCAOB, and I do want to commend the PCAOB for the incredible process that they went through. The PCAOB outreached to a variety of stakeholders many times and had a very open forum, gathering information, gathering points of view, hearing from the critical stakeholders in the process before they even issued their concept release. And so I think the PCAOB should be commended upon that. But what we've heard in our discussions, and I think what the PCAOB has heard through their outreach, is that investors actually do like the current model. They like the current pass-fail model because there's a certain amount of simplicity, it's easy to understand, but they are looking for more information about the process. So I don't read the PCAOB's proposal as getting rid of the current model, but rather supplementing the current model to give more information. So one of the things that or a couple of the broad level things that the PCAOB is asking is, should there be an auditor's discussion and analysis? So should the auditor address the areas of risk that they've identified looking at the company? And so we talked a little bit about that earlier this morning. Also, they've proposed or asked about expanded use of emphasis paragraphs that would draw attention to important matters about the financial statements and disclosures. Auditor assurance on other information outside of the financial statements, and then finally clarifying language in the standard auditor's report. So the CAQ has already submitted a preliminary comment letter to the PCAOB on these various areas. And as we did so, we outlined 5 basic principles that we would hope help guide the PCAOB in their discussion and their consideration of these 4 components to the proposal. And the first one was that auditors should not be the original source of disclosure about a company, but rather that is information that should come from the company itself. The second is that any changes to the reporting model should enhance or at least maintain audit quality. So there really should be a focus on whatever we do to the reporting model will raise the level of audit quality. The third is that the reporting model should narrow, or at least not expand, the expectations gap. The fourth principle is that any changes to the reporting model should add value to investors and help investors rather than inadvertently serve to confuse investors. And so what we mean about here is that there should not be dueling information put out into the marketplace, that the management says one thing, the auditor says another thing, and perhaps even the audit committee says yet another thing. So we're concerned about that. And then the fifth is that the auditor's reporting should be objective rather than subjective. So in our minds, those are the guiding principles that we should all be thinking about as we engage in this debate. And one of the things that we have done is we have taken the 4 components of the PCAOB's proposal, or it's not even a proposal, concept release, and actually done a mock-up of several of those components, of 3 of those 4 components, to see what it would actually look like. And so we have shared that information with the PCAOB, and it's also available on our website. So I encourage you at your leisure to go look at that. One of the things, though, that the PCAOB has asked about is providing information in the form of an auditor's discussion and analysis. And in our minds, what they're really getting at there perhaps is, should the auditor provide information to the marketplace akin to the information that they provide to the audit committee? And so one of the things that we want to caution about that, again, going back to our first principle, that it should be the information should come from management rather than the auditor, is that the communications between the auditor and the audit committee is really envisioned in a 2-way discussion or dialogue. This is a conversation that goes on between the auditor and the audit committee. And there's a lot of nuance there. There's a lot of subjectivity that goes on in the discussions. And so we're concerned that perhaps somehow capturing that information and disclosing that information in a way that does not reflect the 2-way conversation might not be as helpful to the marketplace as having auditors somehow be associated with the information that management puts out and somehow attest to that information and perhaps even expanding that information. So that's one of the things that we're continuing to look at the CAQ, and that I think is an important issue that we should be talking about when we talk about the reporting model that auditors currently use. So we will share with what we've heard in our roundtable discussions with the PCAOB as part of our comment letter process. We're hearing similar things from investors that I've just kind of outlined for you, and of course it colors the work that we're doing at the CAQ. Investors do want more information about a company and how a company's risk profile looks and how a company operates, but they seem to want that information more from the company itself, with the auditor being somehow associated with the processes that the company uses to gather that information and disclose that information. And so that's a subtle distinction, but I think it's an important one, because I think it keeps the responsibility where it, in my mind, properly lies, and that is with the company itself, but that the auditor follows along behind and is associated with that information. Now, what information we're talking about and how much association is something that I think we all have to wrestle through, and that is continuing work that we're going to have to do at the CAQ. One of the other things that I think is important, particularly at a global forum such as this, is that we need to be consistent, I think, in our thinking, or at least in our approaches to this, and have a consistent dialogue across the globe about these issues, because I think all jurisdictions are looking at these issues, and you could easily envision a situation or a world where every jurisdiction addresses these important issues. We all agree that these are the important issues of the day, but come up with different solutions to these issues, if you will, and then would further fracture the marketplace and further, perhaps, lead to confusion to investors. So another issue that we are looking at the CAQ is one that we've also touched at this morning, and that is this whole issue of objectivity, independence, and skepticism. And these are, of course, foundations to high-quality audits, and very, very important discussions to have. And in some quarters, including in the European Union by Commissioner Barnier, and also by PCAOB Chairman Jim Doty, there have been discussions about how to address some of the independence, objectivity, and skepticism issues, including mandatory firm rotation, or, as we discussed earlier today too, audit-only firms. And I think that that we need to, as a group, really think long and hard about these issues and not rush to a solution to what is perhaps a perceived problem without really thinking through what those consequences could be. And we've started that discussion earlier. I'm not going to be able to add anything that Rick and Galen haven't said. They are much more eloquent on these issues than I, but I think they've hit those very issues, and we all need to think about that. With respect to an audit-only firm, I do want to highlight, though, something that Kevin said and something that we also talked a little bit about this morning, and that is the importance of attracting high-quality people to the profession. I do think that having multidisciplinary firms who look at not only audit issues but also tax and other advisory issues lead to both better information within that firm, as well as a more attractive profession to people entering the profession. And there are other ways to address some of these independence issues, such as prohibition of certain services to the companies that the firms provide audit services to, much as we have in Sarbanes-Oxley. Does not mean that that shouldn't be revisited in the United States and elsewhere across the globe, but I think that there are other ways to address that issue that can be highly effective, short of mandatory rotation and or audit-only firms. Well, I guess not and or audit-only firms, because if you had mandatory rotation, you wouldn't necessarily have to have audit-only firms. So I just want to put that on the table. I don't have easy solutions to what those alternatives could be, but I do want to stress that the profession does take very seriously the independence, objectivity, and skepticism issues, and we can, as a profession, certainly improve. This is one of these areas of continuous improvement. You're never going to get it right, and we do all need to partner together to think about how we can address those issues, perceived or real. We're hoping to issue something in the fall, and it will include webcasts, training sessions, and seminars based on the content. So we're really excited about that partnership with FEI, the NACD, and the IIA to create these scenarios. We're also working with FEI to create a financial fraud literacy test that would allow CPE credit. It would be an online test for FEI's members to take, and will also help inform our partnership with these other organizations to see are there common areas of fraud that we've not yet focused on. I also want to talk about the importance of research with respect to enhancing audit quality and some of the work that we do at the CAQ. We do conduct a Main Street investor survey every year. We're getting ready to go out into the field on our 5th one. And what we found there is that even in this time of extreme economic crisis, there is high confidence in the capital markets and in audited financial statements. So there is that trust there, and I think that's an important thing to understand, because that is something that as we talk about who should be providing what information and what the role of the auditor is, there is trust in the audit process as it currently exists, and that's an important factor to keep into mind. We also do a variety of scholarly research, and we fund that. So again, this year we put out a request for proposals, or actually we did it in December. We received over 48 proposals that address topics as audit quality, financial statement fraud deterrence and detection, not a surprise because it's a big interest for the CAQ, professional judgment, and again, professional skepticism. And the ones that were awarded are here on the screen. I'm not going to read those for you, but these are the academic research projects that were awarded funding this year. And we are in our 3rd year of providing these grants, and we're just now starting to see some of the preliminary findings from our 1st round of grants. So I'm excited when those are ready to be shared, because the goal there is to try to foster the type of academic research that is helpful to the profession, that is actionable and is practical for the profession, and then at the same time working to help academics understand the kind of research and academic and scholarly work that can help the profession increase audit quality. So we're excited about that. A number of us are off to Denver in a few weeks for the AAA conference, and the CAQ prior to that conference holds a symposium where again we bring academics together along with the profession to talk about these kinds of helpful scholarly research that can help the profession. And so I also have to give a plug to NASBA because they've established a program of its own, and they are doing accounting education research grants that I think the first ones were awarded in May, so I applaud NASBA for doing that. I think this kind of work that's done by the CAQ and NASBA really does help the profession understand ways to improve audit quality that we might not think of on our own. So that's a brief look at the work of the Center for Audit Quality. I do want to again underscore the importance of this event, bringing together global regulators to talk about these issues. I think is of critical importance. We need to have consistency in our approaches. That doesn't mean that there's a one-size-fits-all answer, but I think it behooves us all to think about these issues collectively and to try to broach them in a way that acknowledges what it is that we're all trying to do, so that there aren't fractured and very different approaches to some of the same problems, much as Robert discussed in his program. So I want to thank David and Ken and Michael and Linda and the other leadership of NASBA for bringing this together, and thank all of you for your attention and time this morning. I think we have time for a few questions, so I'm happy to take any questions that you have or spur the conversation further if you'd like. So you don't even have to give me questions, you can give me thoughts.
Okay, well, I have a question, and well, actually I have a comment on one of the earlier observations, and I find only CPAs could figure out a way to lose money in a service that's statutorily mandated across the world. So I think we should rethink our competitive issues that you talked about here in Canada. But I am very encouraged with your fraud initiatives and so forth. I was going to comment on that even if you hadn't mentioned it. But it seems to me regularly and with stunning frequency across our history that the expectation gap still remains, and that even the finest and most sophisticated, the largest CPAs firms in the world are regularly snockered by swindlers and thieves. And I just wonder if it's time to, or what will be the process to sort of re-engineer the entire audit process And to what extent will these studies and your initiatives be brought into auditing standards to identify basically the most simplest frauds perpetrated by some crook in a corner office with a laptop over the finest army of auditors spending millions of dollars a year on these audits, and can be circumvented just with a couple of clicks. And I just wondered how that would be incorporated based on your studies.
Yeah, we've been very open and sharing with the PCOB and the SEC of the work that we're doing. I know it's something that the PCOB is considering how to fund and set up their anti-fraud center, although there, of course, have been many intervening pressures upon our regulatory community to address issues of the day. But I do think it's important that we not lose sight of the important work, because that's a fundamental problem that we're always going to have to fight. And so sharing the kind of information that we've gathered, continuing to work on these collaborative projects, continuing to sponsor research in this area, I think are all ways to help address the issue. But I do worry that given what's going on in the marketplace right now, and we have no choice but to focus on the role of the auditor and some of these issues that are being looked at globally, that we don't lose sight of the fundamentals, which I think is what we're talking about, right? The fundamentals of deterring and detecting financial reporting fraud is a day in, day out fundamental thing that auditors need to do. And so keeping that forefront in mind, even as we deal with these other issues, I think is important.
Thank you to the panel. My question is not to you, Cindy, so you can relax. It's really a comment to the panel and a comment to the audience. I think you have mentioned that the fact that there are really three sets of important international sets of standards that are in various stages of development. Robert mentioned international financial reporting standards, others mentioned international standards on auditing, and you've all mentioned the word independence somewhere in your presentations. I think our concern has to be that if we took some timeline, and I'm not as pessimistic as Cindy about what the SEC will say, if we took some timeline as to where we would be in terms of global acceptance of IFRS, then if this is the timeline, IFRS is somewhere close to here, to the end. ISA's, auditing standards, are close to here. But frankly, ethics and independence standards are back here. And that's because we've got built-in prejudices, and I use that word genuinely, that we know what is right for ethical standards in our jurisdiction. And Robert mentioned the challenge of international acceptance of standards. There are some countries in the world, many of them represented in this room, who would have as a basic statement of principle, I will not employ my brother in my business. In other countries, the principle is absolutely reversed. The first person I will employ is my brother. And so when we try and think about independence, we are dealing with totally different cultural backgrounds as to how you consider applying the simple rules of independence that we write in our codes of independence. And all of us in this room really represent the North American contingent, is some South American, and there are some Asian too, but many in this room are represented by a single model of culture, whether it's the Anglo-Saxon model or the imperialistic model, but it is one that we live with, which when we take it global is incredibly difficult. But the fourth set of standards that I would, with respect, suggest none of the speakers have talked about are accounting standards for the public sector. And most of us live in either federal, state, or municipal environments who are bankrupt or close to bankrupt. And we mustn't forget, as we talk about the work that we're looking for here and the international debate that we're having here, that we're not just talking about public interest listed companies. We're talking about governments under sovereign debt crisis. And all of us have mandates and responsibilities for auditors who audit those institutions. And we often leave them hanging out there alone, and we think about what we must do and mandate for the accounting firms. But we shouldn't forget the auditors general and their equivalents around the world who are under immense pressure to deal with auditing countries who are going into default. And it's interesting to see that only last week the senior global partners from the 6 firms met with the Financial Stability Board and as a team announced that they needed to make sure the FSB understood that whatever happened in Greece would be considered a default. And that somewhere auditors representing those firms who would audit most of the holders of the Greek debt would be dealing with write-downs and impairments. And it's going to be interesting to see where the $13 billion of write-downs is going to show up in financial statements, all of which is probably going to show up in the next 8 days because they're all dealing with the 6-month financial statements of the holders of those debts. So I just really wanted to encourage us as we thought through the rest of the important issues that we're debating here in this day and a half, not to forget that segment of the market which is auditing the public sector as well as the private sector. Thank you.
I have nothing nearly as significant as what Jim just said. This is more just an elaboration on what Cindy said about the endorsement paper that this SEC staff put out. And by the way, I'm Terry Poley. I'm the president and CEO of the Financial Accounting Foundation, which is the parent of the FASB and the GASB, which sets public sector standards. The FAF obviously is very interested in the outcome of what happens with the SEC and their decision on where we're heading as a nation. And our trustees are looking at the current white paper and developing a response. And we knew that we weren't going to be able to get something in by July 31st. So I called Croker for a dispensation. And
Which I'm sure he gave you.
He gave us, and he indicated that, you know, that the July 31st date is not so much a deadline, that they will take comments after that. And I just would encourage everyone in the room, don't be, don't feel that you have to comment by July 31st, but please do comment. And if you need more time, call the chief accountant's office and let them know. But if you think about it, this is probably the most significant potential change since the Wheat Committee put the FASB into existence in the early 70s. So it's very, very important for, for everyone really to weigh in. So I know that our trustees will be considering this at their August meeting, so it'll be, our letter will be issued sometime after that. But I just would encourage everyone to take your time and write a thoughtful letter, and it's definitely worth taking that time to do so. Thanks.